Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to look at Asian American and Asian Pacific American literature. First, I want to start off by going to the CCBC statistics that we had talked about a couple of times, and you often see referred to in some of the literature you've been reading. The Cooperative Children's Book Center, of course, maintains the statistics, and I wanted to take a look at their Asian Pacific numbers. So if you remember, beginning in 85 to 93, they only were looking at total of books by Black authors and illustrators. Then they decided to slowly expand what they were collecting statistics on. And from 94 to 2001, they just combined by and about the number of books that were by and the number of books about Asian Pacific and Asian Pacific Americans. Beginning in 2002, they split it apart and looked at how many were by and how many were about. And these numbers can be tricky because you can have books written by Asian authors that don't necessarily include Asian characters. And you can have, of course, books with Asian characters not written by Asian authors. But I have to say, looking at these statistics, Asian and Asian Pacific's books are the best represented of all of the books that they track. So if you look at 2017 statistics, African Americans, 122 books by African Americans, about African Americans over 340. That's the largest chunk there, but it's closely followed up by the 310 about Asia Pacifics, and the representation, or the number by, is much higher. You have 274 there, as compared to American Indian First Nation, because this also includes Canadian books. Only 38 by, and only a total of 72 books about. And even Latinos, who are a much bigger population in terms of percentage, really don't have the representation that Asian Pacifics have. If you look, what they've done here in this chart is separated out just books from U.S. publishers. Their first chart includes all publishers, which basically, I just think American and Canadian, maybe. I don't think they receive British. I don't know. But if you look at just the US ones, numbers are still track about the same. There's not that much difference. There's about 200 fewer books represented in here. And you can see the numbers are about the same. So I just thought it was good to look at that again and compare them to how they do against other populations. None of these numbers are staggeringly large. If you think about 310 out of 3,700 books, that's not a lot of books and not a lot of representation. So what is Asia? And what do we mean by Asian books? This map is from the World Book, and it shows the Asian continent, which includes some of what we considered under Middle Eastern literature, a total of 50 countries, which also includes Russia. See, it includes Saudi Arabia, what we consider the Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, Japan, East Timor, Philippines, Indonesia. So you can see this whole area is considered the Asian continent. Interestingly, if you look at travel maps, for example, Lonely Planet, and this is not, I can't figure out how to make this map bigger, but it does not include the Middle East. They just go Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, some of the stands, Pakistan, Mongolia, China, and then out to the Pacific Ocean here, and a lot of this is the same. Rough Guides includes even fewer countries, in that it knocks out Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, and some of these countries, and includes only really the southeastern Asian part, southeastern Asia. So the different, they're grouped together: southeastern, southwestern, northern Asia. Um, and you can see that it's a huge, huge swath. Even this limited map that cuts off some of the other countries, it's the most limited, includes 24 countries and a huge swath of land. And I think I read that China contains 20% of the population of the world. So you can see that the Asian population is huge also. Includes a huge, even considering it at its smallest, contains a huge number of individuals. The one of the articles that you're reading for this week included a search for Asian children's material in the catalog, and these are the terms that they used: Asia, Asian, Burma, Burmese, China, Chinese, East Indian, Filipino, Hmong, India, not Indian because they probably would have gotten American Indians in there, Japan, Japanese, Korea, Korean, Laos, Philippines, Thai, Vietnam, Vietnamese, and even those don't include Taiwan or Cambodia or some other areas that might be considered more Pacific. And so you can see that it's really difficult to, as the other groups that we've talked about, it's not, it's certainly not a homogeneous group. It has many different cultures, and we're grouping it together in a really big, encompassing term. And that's actually one of the reasons why this week I gave you identifiers as to where some of the books came from and focused on in the book list that I gave you, just to show you some of the range of what we were discussing. And as you can see, if you're talking about Asian, sometimes there's overlap between that and Middle Eastern because it is part of the Asian continent, but we considered them separate. So once again, we can't have a single story about Asians because they're so big that even the name is not just Asian, it's Asian Pacific, and we have to be careful not to think of Asians as just one single population, which is something we've also needed to do for each of the other types of other groups that we've looked at in different ways. They reflect different backgrounds and have different elements of culture that are involved in there. So if you read a book based on China with Chinese characters in it, or Chinese American characters, you're not going to properly represent the whole Asian community. So you have to have multiple books with different materials in them, which I think is not a surprise to you at this point. Some of the stereotypes that face Asians, and if you think actually back to some early Hollywood representations, Charlie Chan, and I think Jerry Lewis played an awful stereotypical Asian person. I think there was one with Mickey Rooney too. Very often, as you can tell by the names I'm saying, if you know who they are, they were not played by individuals, not played by Asians. So if there was somebody Chinese, they would not be played by by a Chinese individual. They just were not seen in leading roles particularly. And I don't know if you follow the Emmys, just some Emmy nominations just came out, and Sandra Oh is in a new show. I forget if it's on HBO or Hulu or something, and she's the main the main character, and she received a nomination. I think this is like one of the first times an Asian American has been nominated for the main character in a show. I think she was nominated several times for what was that? What was she in? It's not ER, it's the other, Grey's Anatomy, but she wasn't the lead actress as she is in this one. And it's just ridiculous that it's taken so long for Asians to be played by Asians and for them to get recognition for their work. So some of the stereotypes that we see in talking about Asians and in Asian literature is this idea of them being a model minority. In other words, the smart, hardworking, Asians are going to pass all the tests, and they're going to, because they're Asian, they're going to be smarter than everybody else and do better than everybody else, and it's an unfair advantage, where it's kind of attributing something to them, to their race, that is more just a something that they adopt, and that isn't adopted by it's a stereotype, and not everyone plays into that model minority concept or wants to be a model minority. And part of the reason this phrase also has implicit within it the idea that it makes them it makes the minority group being talked about more acceptable because they fit into kind of our ideals of what is successful. And Asians who follow this successful path we feel comfortable with because it's something that we understand, as opposed to having to understand cultural differences. The problem with the model minority idea is not everybody subscribes to this, and it can be difficult for the Asian American who is not falling into that model minority vein, and not being the excellent student and just being a normal kid. And it could also lead to overlooking when students are having issues, because just assume they're Asian, they're going to do fine because they have a mom and dad who are going to push them, and the whole tiger mom idea, which has been debunked, etc. There's also this stereotype of inscrutability, not showing any emotion, and being having a Confucian philosophy that led to certain ideas about Asians that, of course, are not. Inscrutability also kind of leads to an idea of a lack of emotion, which certainly is not true. As with all minorities, there's the issue of all looking the same, but it seems to be even more stressed, or more of a stereotype with Asian Americans, especially Chinese, Japanese. And there's a difference in the facial characteristics of different Asian populations, and of course they don't all look the same. But that's one of the problems with some of the stereotypical portrayals in illustrations, that it's just easier, like, not to give them individual characteristics when they're drawing out. And the Five Chinese Brothers, which you'll read about in your the readings I gave you, having exactly the same features, but also everybody in the background being exactly the same. So you can't differentiate. I mean, obviously the Five Chinese Brothers are supposed to look similar, but you can't even differentiate them from the people in the background. It's just all of this rather stereotypical drawing that plays on characteristics that are common to many people, but not exactly the same. Also, the idea of an exotic other, which extends across all of Asia. There's differences. They're seen as, or we've developed a media presentation of them, of Asian countries as having, if you think of Chinese being, the culture being so pagodas and exotic in terms of how it looks. Indians are considered exotic, even Arabs considered exotic in that they're they're not what we are. They're different than us, and they have different cultures and different ways of demonstrating that culture, but we consider it exotic and look at them as somebody that doesn't belong in our culture. And Orientalism also is an extension of this exotic other, and it's a perception of Asia that was created by the West as exotic, backwards, uncivilized, and at times dangerous. And if you think about how long China has been around and how long India has been civilized and have governments. China created movable type before we did in the West with Gutenberg. China developed gunpowder. Not that that's a good measure of civilization, but they created many inventions before they were created in the West, or they were brought to the West from Asia. So the idea of them being backwards or uncivilized, I was reading an article too, sometimes you see portrayals of India as very backwards when it's actually a technological hub with a lot of cities and has been around for years and years and years. So there's a huge rich cultural background and culture and history going farther back than we can in America. Although Europe also sees them old, and Europe's been around for a while, but Europe also sees them as uncivilized. So if you think about some of the common portrayals in movies of Asian culture, whether it be Indian or Chinese or Japanese, it's often a very exotic depiction, which has the effect of separating them from us and creating this idea that they're different and can't assimilate into our culture. The other interesting thing about Asians is they were, in terms of the United States, is the Chinese Exclusion Act was invoked in 1888. That was one of the first groups to be limited, or actually almost completely knocked out of immigration to the United States. The idea of a paper son comes from immigrants from China, where after the Exclusion Act of 1888, they could only be admitted if they were part of the family, so they could bring family over, but they had to be tested. So they asked the person who was here certain questions and then tested the individuals coming over to see if they could answer the questions to prove that they were part of the family. And often this was this crackdown on immigration was subverted in that they would have a cousin or somebody outside of who was allowed come in, and they would give them the same answers. They would give them answers so that they could pass the test. It also caused problems. There's a really good book, I think it's by Alan Say. It also caused problems for actual relatives in that sometimes they had to study to make sure they had the right answers for the tests, because just saying they were kin did not make it. So there's a lot of negative stereotypes and different kinds of stereotypes than we see with other groups, but still an erasure of them as individuals that needs to be addressed. And so I hopefully have given you some books this week to read that are written by people within the culture. In one case, I gave you the choice of a translated book, which I read this week this year for a presentation I did. It was a notable book, and it was translated from the Chinese, and I really liked it because it was written not for an American audience, but written for a Chinese audience. So you really got and it was during the culture, the culture wars in China, and so you really got an insider's look at the culture through that book. All right, some resources. There is the American Pacific American Librarians Association, and they have an award, a literature award for all ages. I gave you some books off of this, but they have adult fiction, adult nonfiction, young adult literature, children's literature, and picture books. And this is on your list. I actually have not read this, but I've heard such amazing things about it. So that's a good resource. Another resource that's not particularly, I just wanted to mention it because it was in one of your readings. Actually, I think maybe it wasn't in one of your readings. It was one of the things I was considering giving to you, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of it. Most of what we've given you to read this semester has been material that it has been either translated or was written for American audience, but you might have students in your school who you need to find material for in their own language, and this can be a resource. It's the International Children's Digital Library, and it contains books in many different languages. So, and it's a free resource. I think you can sign up for it, but you don't need to necessarily, I don't think there's a charge for it, and there's free material to use. So if you have, there's just some books where it's difficult to get the material in that language. Serbian, I would imagine you don't have a lot of Serbian books, but you can go here and take a look, and it gives the children a chance to read in their own language. And you can provide them access to this so that they have another, it's just always so comforting to go back and read in your own language. And if there's been studies that have shown that if you're fluent in your own language, it makes it easier for you to be fluent in the language that you're learning. In the language that you're, so in English. So this is a nice resource to share with the parents in your library. I mean, the parents in your schools. They might want to read to their children in their own language. There are some books in English. And some of these books, I mean, they're limited as to what's donated to be put into this database, and they're also limited by some of the translators. This is actually interesting. It's English, but it's published in Kenya, so that would be a really good one for your African American selections. Because the interesting thing I always find with this, like I said with the Chinese book, is that it's not written for an American audience. So you're getting something written for the Kenyan audience. So you get I think a more culturally true slice of life. So this is just something to keep in mind as a resource for you in your classroom or in your library. And that's all I have to say today about this. So I will see you on the discussion boards. Thank you.